Welcome everybody. And if you are here hopefully for the panel discussion on ChatGPT. It is everywhere. Is it ready? Are we? And so my name is Jordan Boyd Graber. I'm an associate professor here in computer science. I'll be moderating this panel. And I just wanted to set the stage a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. And so just to back up the assertion, ChatGPT is everywhere. I am getting emails from prospective PhD students that all look eerily similar. And if you give it a prompt, write a letter to a prospective PhD advisor, you all get the same output, and that's what I'm seeing. Lawyers are getting sanctioned for citing cases that ChatGPT made up. It is appearing in homework submissions. It's being debated on Capitol Hill. People are using it to automate their dating search, and people are using it to create job applications. So it is everywhere, but is that a good thing? That's hopefully one of the things that we'll discuss with our great panel. But before I jump in, I want to have a bit of a discussion about terminology. What do you call these models? So here's a family tree of the various models that have come out, including GPT. And although we are moving away from it, there was a trend of calling these models Muppets. And that has kind of fallen by the wayside, but I would like to make an argument for calling these models Muppet models. And so an alternative name for the general term, the general class of these models is large language models. So why isn't that a good choice, in my opinion? They're not just being applied to language. You can generate images on DALL-E or Stable Diffusion. They're being applied to chemistry problems. They're being applied to sound. It's not just language. Our old language models, for those of us old enough to remember, were pretty big too. But these models are fundamentally different. And so I would propose that we should call them Muppet models. If you talk to someone from Stanford, they will say you should call these foundation models. And funnily enough, Stanford has a center called the Center for Research on Foundation Models that they launched when they proposed this term. I don't particularly like this because foundation implies that you should be building on them. They're useful tools, but maybe not the best thing to build on. Maybe there are alternatives. So my proposal for calling these things Muppet models, and so a Muppet model is a model that generates language, a model that's controllable, and a model that has absorbed information from its training data. And I think this fits well with Muppets in the definitional aspect. Muppets are interactive, they're controllable, you can stick your hand inside of it through all of the layers and get it to do what you want it to do. And another reason to call them Muppet models is the strong connection to the University of Maryland. So Jim Henson, who had a BS degree from the University of Maryland in the 60s, created the first Muppet. Not a Muppet model that can run on a computer. Mohit Iyer, a former student of mine, created Elmo, the Muppet model that created the craze, and Jacob Devlin, who got his master's degree here, created BERT, which was...
That settles it.
I think so. That's why I think we should call them Muppet models. And I will annoy all of you by doing exactly that for the rest of this panel. Okay, but you all did not come here to hear about that. And before we jump into introducing the panel, you might think that GPT is a counterexample to this, but GPT was almost named after a Muppet, and indeed they were going to call it Snuffleupagus, or Snuffy for short. And so if you don't know from Sesame Street, this is a Muppet that is very large, like GPT, but only some people can see, which fits for the latest versions of GPT that are relatively difficult to inspect or interact with, at least its innards. Okay, And I have more to say about Muppet models, but I won't subject that to you here. I have a YouTube rant about that if you're interested. But I think it fits well. Muppets are fun, interactive, multilingual, but they can make stuff up. And if you want a high quality Muppet these days, you have to go through a large multinational corporation. Okay, so finally, turning to our panel, I'd like to introduce to you on the far that side, yeah, I don't know whether to say, yeah, so stage left, Ellen Voorhees. Yeah, one of the benefits of being in a young field like computer science is that you get to meet your heroes. And so I was very glad that Ellen accepted our invitation. Ellen Voorhees has a PhD from Cornell and has been a bulwark at NIST, where she managed the Text Retrieval Conference. And even if you haven't heard of Text Retrieval Conference, or TREC for short, those evaluations define in many ways the world that we live in. They provided the rigorous evaluations that made things like Google search or Siri possible, and to know if they were actually doing a good job. And if you'd like to know more about the story, I heartily recommend Ellen's retrospective, The Evolution of Cranfield, which tells the story of how this evolved over time. And she's a fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery and a fellow of the Washington Academy of Science. We're very lucky to have her today. So thank you very much for coming. I will now jump to the far right with He He. He is an assistant professor at New York University after a stint as a postdoc at Stanford, where she has launched an impressive career looking at how creative humans can work with Muppet models and generative AI more broadly for things like captioning images and writing poetry. She's also made impressive progress on more bread and butter tasks in natural language processing, like summarizing documents, translation, and decoding. And full disclosure, she has accomplished all of that despite the handicap of having one Jordan Boyd Graber as advisor. So next to He is Tammy Clegg. Tammy Clegg is an associate professor in the College of Information Studies and College of Education at the University of Maryland, and has a PhD from Georgia Tech. One of the broad themes of Tammy's research is that she tries to see the real human consequences of technology on groups that might not be able to advocate for themselves when people are designing new technologies and putting them into places like the classroom. And what I really respect about Tammy's research is that she doesn't just stay in the ivory tower, but actively engages with real people like a horde of grade schoolers to help bring them into the design of these new, sometimes scary technologies. And finally, in the center, Oma Sadiq is a reporter for Bloomberg Government, where she covers artificial intelligence, social media, privacy, Section 230, antitrust, misinformation, and telecom on Capitol Hill. And I realized that I didn't pause after He He and Tammy for applause, so let's give the entire panel a round of applause. Yeah, and so what I thought I would do is start off with a couple of questions that I thought of, but I really would like to make this interactive. So if you have questions or things that you would like to ask for the panel, be ready, think of it, and in a couple of minutes after we've gone through a couple of questions, we'll open it up to the audience. Yeah, so I'd like to start with Ellen. You were one of the pioneers of information retrieval. Someone has something that they need to know, they sit down at a computer, they type what they want, and hopefully get a correct answer. How good are Muppet models at this task compared to, say, our favorite search engine?
Okay, I should probably do some disclaimers here. One of which is I'm not a fan of Muppet models or large language models or whatever you want to call them. So I should put those biases just up front. In fact, I don't think, say 3 months ago, which was a lifetime in the history of large language model or Muppet models, there were all these articles on LinkedIn and any place else you looked saying how ChatGPT was a Google killer, or a Bing killer, or pick your favorite search engine killer. I think that's absurd, frankly, because one of the main problems with these large language models is they make things up, right? and they make it up very confidently, right? There's no expression of confidence or anything else. They just flat out say it, and it's just flat out wrong, surprisingly often. And who is using search engines, right? Unless you're evaluating search engines or something of the sort, right? You're there at a time when you don't know what the answer is. And so if you're going to get an answer and you're going to actually try and use that answer, right? Ask the lawyer who put it in his brief. You're going to have to go search for whether or not that's true. And if you're going to go search for whether or not that's true, just use the search engine to begin with. Having said that, given something concrete to search is easier than a broader, right? So maybe it's useful as a way of broadening what you might want to go search for. But that's, in my opinion, the only thing they are good for in terms of search.
Yeah, any reactions to that from the rest of the panel? Okay.
+1. Violent reactions over here.
Okay, so apart from information-seeking stuff, one of the big worries that people have about Muppet models is that if people use them, it will decrease their creativity. So, you've done some work looking at this. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so recently we showed that if you use these large language models to help you write, in particular to autocomplete a piece of writing, it kind of homogenizes people's writing, meaning two persons will write more similarly to each other and the overall diversity of the produced content would decrease. However, I think on the more optimistic side, when people use these models, they're not as simple as just autocomplete and then either accept or reject. We would prompt the model to get more specific suggestions like, could you critique this piece of writing or maybe help me find words with stronger emotions? I think in these settings, the model actually is more like a tool to help people release their creativity. But the concern here is that the implicit assumption that's making here is that people who are using these models already knows how to write good essays, because then they could come up with these specific prompts. But then when it comes to the educational setting, like a student who has not yet mastered the writing skills, rely too much on these tools, then they might not have the ability to give useful prompts for the model and also not able to distinguish good from poor writing. And in these cases, I do think there's the risk that it would limit the growth space of the students.
Okay, well, since you mentioned education, I'll follow up with Tammy. Apart from verifying information, what is your take on where Muppet models are getting used in education today? Where do you see promise and where do you see dangers?
Yeah, no, I've seen some really cool examples. Kind of building on what Ho was saying, I've seen examples where researchers and educators have used these models to help young people to really be more creative. Like I've seen an example where young people were invited to use generative models to create their own new images, and so they had to learn about AI and how to do these AI, how to create, the language, how to give the AI systems a language to create new images and things like that. And then they actually displayed those images in like museums and things like that. So I think from that perspective, that's where you see the educators actually honing in on the creativity and helping our young people to use these systems in really creative ways. I think on the other hand, you see this sort of in the much larger sphere, you see there people being on one extreme or the other, right? So either being really fearful, oh my gosh, everybody's going to use this to cheat. How I need to ban ChatGPT and just not allow them to use it at all. Or we see it on the other hand where people want to use it, but they're not focused on really helping the kids use it in these really generative and creative ways. I think one of the concerns that I always have is that some of the things that ChatGPT does, or systems like ChatGPT do, is that they actually are actually restorative activities for our young people. So Oma was just asking me before the session, how are the students? And I was telling her that, anxiety is really big among our undergraduate, population. And I know for me, one of the things that's been most helpful with anxiety has been actually the process of writing, journaling, whether it's, writing my papers or my research, or so actually coming up with that language. And I feel like when we take that responsibility away from our young people, we're actually taking away some of the restorative activities that they're able to do. So we know we would never ask a system like ChatGPT to go work out for us, right? We know that wouldn't work, right?
Speak for yourself.
Sometimes that's what it would defeat the purpose, right? So we want to help our young people to be able to use it in these really generative ways.
Okay, Oma, as someone who writes for a living, as a journalist, how do you see the role of Muppet models in your career? Does it help you be more creative, or does it make it more difficult for you to sort between fact and fiction?
Right. So as a reporter, I actually do not rely on chatbots for my daily job. But that's not to say that newsrooms aren't incorporating generative AI to help make our lives easier in ways. At Bloomberg, we have a product that allows users, customers, readers, our audience to sort through legislative bills and to sort through analysis. And so we've incorporated AI to help make that tracking easier. So if a reader wanted to find a particular bill in one state, so let's say Georgia, and they wanted to find that same or similar law in another state, they could track that. And through AI, we have systems now that allow them to easily find that, rather than having to manually go through state laws and parse that through and try to find what's similar going on between the states. So we are using AI in those ways to help make it easier for our audience to find information. In terms of just daily writing and reporting, not so much. I think there's still a necessity there for a human to be behind that, to make sure there's the facts there first and not the fiction going out the door. In terms of my job, making my job harder, I think that because there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation out there, and this came before AI, but now there's a lot of evidence out there that generative AI is going to make it so much harder to parse through what's real and what's not. I think that will definitely pose a problem in the near future, if not already right now. We're living through it.
Okay, questions from the audience? I saw Rance's hand first, so.
Thanks. This is a very stimulating conversation. By the way, hello, Ellen. It's great to see you again. Ellen and I were grad students together at Cornell. So my question is maybe, and I forgot your name, I'm sorry, but it has to do with the media coverage of ChatGPT, because it seems I get a flavor of like Bitcoin level hysteria when people talk about ChatGPT and other tools for generating, let's call it content. So do you know any of the backstory about why there's this sort of huge media surge of interest? Are there sort of, does OpenAI have an array of chatbots spewing out press releases to tempt the newsrooms to report? I'm curious about that.
I think the coverage is warranted because of how transformative AI is. And we're hearing this from all stakeholders. We're hearing this from industry. We're hearing this from government, state, local, federal levels. We're hearing this from civil society. We're hearing it from across the board of how important it is to try to get a handle on AI. And so I think that's where you're seeing pretty much everyone woke up to this technology with the onset of ChatGPT last fall. So we're almost a year since then. And the amount of activity that you've seen, I'm on Capitol Hill every day. The amount of activity you've seen in terms of the conversations and how it's shifted pretty much since the spring, where virtually no one was talking about AI at the beginning of this year, and now it's what people are talking about every day. So I think that those conversations from across the board are driving the media coverage.
I'll add something there.
Yeah.
I think part of the reason why the generative models are seen as transformative. I mean, people lie, right? So we've dealt with falsehoods in the past, but this is at scale, right? And it's speed. And the scale and the speed matter. You can reach incredible numbers of people with very little cost And all of that matters. And it's so, I think it is likely to be transformative. And I think it's good to be aware of the ways in which damage might happen.
Hello, I work at Adobe. I've been there for almost 20 years, and this whole influx of AI and generative technology has just shaken us. We've taken a tact, though, of coming at it with our customers in mind and our creatives in mind. And so we're super sensitive to harm and bias. We're super sensitive to where we're getting the knowledge that our models are using. But it's pretty challenging because there's a lot of companies out there that are gobbling up all of human creation in order to create a maybe more capable model. So I was a bit curious. We're a lot of what we've been doing the last year is working on guardrails. So there was concern about even ChatGPT going off and making something up. Well, we're working on technology where we pit one model against another, and one is a fact checker, for example, and it's pushed the results much closer to what you would get from a human. I mean, obviously, if you go out and ask humans, you're going to get a lot of misinformation, especially if you just jump into Twitter or X or whatever it's called today, right? It's just crazy how fast information is coming at people. So I was mostly just curious, what is your take? We're super sensitive to our artists and having their art just gobbled up by a model. But in order to have a more capable model, whether it's a large Muppet language model or something that's creating music or something that's creating video, I'm consulting for a group of screenwriters who are writing screenwriting software, who are doing storyboarding and actual full feature films from AI. And it's challenging to straddle that line. So what's your take on models basically gobbling up everything that we can see and hear? Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing?
Yeah. I guess just to focus the question a little bit, I guess, maybe you could talk about what are the technical aspects of these generative models that prevent direct copying and could actually foster creativity. And then I'll ask Oma to talk about the legal and policy implications of plagiarism at scale.
Yeah, I think the problem of copying is a complex question. So if you're just talking about literal copying, like memorizing a training example, these models, so people are able to elicit the training examples from these models, and I think it's kind of hard to prevent because for some abilities you do need the model to memorize, like a piece of fact. Some entities, the model do need this memorization capability. So this means that it will also memorize some training examples that we don't want to memorize. And so far, there are a large body of literature on how to unlearn certain pieces of examples, but I don't think we have, at this point, has a good solution. Those are not robust. So even if you delete that in one layer, you could still use other methods to elicit the example from other places. And beyond this literal memorization, there's also the model has learned styles from different artists. So even if it is not really copying, it might be learning a particular artist style. And for that, basically, it has, I think at that point, ruined the artist's career if the model cannot produce this at large scale. So I think from the technology's perspective, it's important to have a good definition of what it means for the model to have copied a certain artist's production. And then maybe we could work with policy and laws to have a better solution to this.
Okay, that's a good segue to Oma.
Yeah, so I would say that this is one of the major questions for policymakers right now. And it's already a question that we're seeing in the courts. There's been plenty of lawsuits already from artists, coming from a lot of artists, against these creators of content that uses their content. An element of this was playing out in those strikes in Hollywood. And so I think it's a question that has yet to be answered. I think that's what lawmakers are grappling with. There's been plenty of hearings and briefings that focus on this copyright and intellectual property issue. And there's a strong emphasis to protect artists. But I think it's just too early in time to tell where the conversation might end up. And that's just, the pace of legislating, really, to see when are they going to get enough information to then write laws around this thing. So yeah, I think it's a conversation they're following, in addition to plenty of other concerns that AI has been posing in terms of national security, in terms of, we mentioned disinformation, in terms of even other greater risks that people are thinking about in terms of competitiveness with other countries, mainly China. And so there's a host of problems that lawmakers are considering right now, and copyright intellectual property is among them.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I was just about to ask you to.
No, so I think from my perspective, from an education perspective, I study what's called critical data literacy. And so that's from a data science perspective. And if we look at data science as sort of one of the things that underlies AI models, right? The thing that we say there is that with data science, and I would say really with technology education in general, a lot of times we focus solely on the technical aspects. How do you program? How do you learn to code? How can you create these generative models, right? And so it can easily become about gobbling up because you're not thinking about the socio-technical aspects, right? For us in data science, is thinking about not only how do we collect and store and analyze and manage data, but it's thinking about helping our young people to ask questions like, who's collecting data about me? What are they doing with that data? How are they, what kinds of decisions are being made about me, and how can I affect those decisions myself? And I think if we include more of that type of education across the board in technology education, so you're not just learning how to program, how to build these models and how to do all these things, but you're having some of those conversations that Oma and Hud just talked about just now, then I think that when we send our young people out into the workforce, well, now they're more prepared to have those conversations. And when they go to create these models, it's not just about how do I gobble up as much as I can.
Okay, any questions from this side of the room? I feel like we've been...
Thank you. I have a comment and a question regarding the relation to search. That was the first point. I assume everybody in this room have tried ChatGPT and tried to ask questions and compare it to search. And the first thing you notice is that when you search for something on Google, for example, you get a lot of junk answers and have to go very deep in the search result until you find something useful. While from the first time you find the correct answer in ChatGPT. And there are two things here. First, in the last 20 years, we all know that the World Wide Web had been built to reverse engineer the search. So all the search optimization and have been going on, and the whole web now is totally written in ways to deceive Google, and that's why you're getting junk results from search. And the amazing thing about ChatGPT is that it has been trained on the same corpus, which is the internet, but it can sift through and give you the right answer right away. Obviously, the hallucination is a problem, but I think the bigger problem is fact checking, because even if you get rid of the hallucination, which is definitely will come out in the next couple of years, fact checking is a much bigger problem, because how to check if something getting out of the search or out of ChatGPT is a fact in a time where basically the whole internet had been written by individual people who can put anything on the internet. So what's the fact anymore? So these are more fundamental problem, and I think it goes beyond search and ChatGPT debates. Because now with all this junk, the same way people have written the web in a way to deceive Google, they're going to write the web again now to deceive ChatGPT and other engine in the future. And that will be a bigger problem.
Okay, Ellen, I think that's a question for you.
All right, so that was a lot of things in that question. So adversarial search, right? So it's pretty much what web search is. It's adversarial. That people want their web stuff found, and search engines are trying to return reasonable stuff. There is no reason to suspect, and I'm sure it's already happening, as you say, that it's going to affect ChatGPT now. So maybe at the moment, ChatGPT is giving you the correct answers first when Google isn't, but there's no guarantee that that's going to stay. And it also, to my first point, means you already know what the right answer is. If you ask random questions, you are not necessarily going to get ChatGPT to give you the correct answer right away. How do we address this problem? So another thing that I should say in here, I mean, my original question was, do I think that search engine that the models were going to destroy search engines? No, but it is the other way around, right? Search engines are now using large language models in order to improve their results. That seems, from no personal inside knowledge, but from what I see in the literature from the companies, basically Microsoft and Google and probably some Meta, it appears to be working, that they are able to improve their search results by doing some federation of results from various language models. Do I believe that? Yeah, mostly. Mostly because I believe I have respect for the people who are authoring those papers. So something is happening there. Is it going to be able to undo the adversarial nature of what search has, at least on the web, has become? No, because as long as there's these incentives which are there to return things which are not the best for you, that adversarial nature is always going to be there. What does that mean that we do? There are automated fact-checking systems. They're getting better also. I don't think that that's going to be the be-all and end-all, because they are also then going to be the targets of this adversarial ecosphere. I guess I don't have any actual answer here, other than to acknowledge that yes, that is an adversarial situation. The companies are working very hard, have worked for a decade now plus, to make it, to stay in front of the adversarial nature. As soon as they make a change, right, then everybody else who wants to have their results ranked first also makes a change. Let me stop there. I don't have an answer. My background is in evaluation, right? That's my whole career has been built on trying to evaluate how well systems do particular tasks. And in order to do that, you need a crisp definition of what you want. And that's really hard, right? That's really, really hard. And the closer these systems come to quote unquote human level interaction, the more difficult it's going to be to evaluate them also, because we as humans have not been very good at evaluating humans, right? And all of these problems are going to just be compounded in these systems.
So I actually want to follow up with in my opinion, I think that the reason why ChatGPT works better than a search engine for some kinds of queries is that there hasn't been an incentive to poison ChatGPT yet. And so once people use it to decide where to buy shoes, companies will start doing the same tricks, or well, not the same tricks, but will start doing tricks to make the generative models their new adversarial target. So do you think that those attacks will be successful? Do we have the countermeasures to fight against it, or will it be a constant and often losing battle like we see with web search? Actually, I was.
Yeah, I think the adversarial attack is definitely possible, and we have already seen. I mean, maybe not in the real world, but there are research showing that you're able to poison the training data set of these models by just changing certain web pages, and you can also poison this fine-tuning process if there's malicious annotators. And for the defense strategy, I think in limited domains, maybe that's possible. You could do some data filtering. But if this happening on a large scale, like what's happening with the search engines nowadays, yeah, I don't see a good solution on how this could be prevented.
Okay, so have your fun now. It's like Google in 1997.
I have the following question. I think most of you are focusing on finding out information, but I'm thinking more in terms of the creative aspect of AI. And some of you may be familiar with this paper. There's a paper put up on the archive server, for those who know what the archive server is, from an IBM, 155-page report. And what they did is they compared GPT-4 with ChatGPT, and they made a one-to-one comparison. And what GPT-4 does is far superior, actually, from my point of view, of what ChatGPT does. And give you some examples. They asked someone to write a poem, not a poem, a proof that of the numbers of prime numbers are infinite, but write it in a way that Shakespeare might have written it. And instantaneously, and they did this, and they have made a comparison of that prompt to GPT-4 to GPT-3. So I'm thinking about the future, the creative ability, not looking for information, but creating new works. To me, is where we need to think what we think about.
Okay, Tammy, do you want to respond to that, or Oma? Either, yeah.
I think one of the most creative aspects of that you said was actually the actual search for that, right? So who thought of how can we create a proof in the form of Shakespeare, right? I think that's one of the things that we really need to help our young people to do, right? So that creativity was just as much the user as it was the system.
Yeah. Oma, did you want to say something?
Wait, I know it sounds like a little bit of doomsday over here for us talking about all the risks associated with AI. And I'll just take it from the perspective that's happening right now on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of emphasis at the same time, beyond just the risks, about the innovation that AI can bring. And so you see industry leaders, a month ago, a bunch of tech CEOs came. We saw Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, the whole lot of them, to tell members of Congress that this technology also has the potential to do good and to spur advancements in healthcare, education, financial services, agriculture, everywhere. There's Senator Mike Rounds, a Republican from South Dakota. He tells this story to emphasize that how incorporating AI can spur advancements, about how his late wife, who died of cancer a couple of years ago, how through AI incorporated treatments, it extended her life by 5 months. And so he tells the story to say, well, that was back then, that was 2 years ago. Now the technology is rapidly advancing. So let's try to harness this and utilize this to our advantage as well. So it's top of mind for them that they know that this technology also has the power to create this change that they're hoping for. But at the same time, it's about right now the question before them is balancing that with the risks which some of them we've discussed now.
Okay, let's go to, I want to balance between the sides. Yep.
One aspect of human thinking is that we're able to unlearn things. And unlearning doesn't just mean forgetting. It remembers that we had the knowledge and we've determined in some way that it's false, so that we don't get there again. Are models there yet? Can we, someone up there mentioned the fact that we might have to teach a model to unlearn an untruth. When we do that, I guess question one is, can we do that now? And if so, are we just teaching the model to forget the untruth, or do we teach it that the content it generated was untrue so that it doesn't do it again?
So I can comment on that question. So yeah, so I think on learning, what people hope is to actually let the model forget that. So the model just doesn't have the notion of this false claim. But in reality, what's happening is you could, of course, fine-tune the model true and false statements so that the model internally labels certain claims as false. So that if you ask for the true statement, it will give you the corresponding ones. But the risk here is that if the model doesn't really completely delete that or forget it internally, someone malicious could still elicit that generation using other ways. So the model can still generate those using certain prompts or certain probing methods. I think that's the
and my favorite example of this, and this is more benign, is that there's a well-known fallacy called the Monty Hall problem, where there are tons of things on the internet where in a particular setup, if you're it's a game show and it's always in your interest to switch doors. And if you give these models problems like this, where there's a notion of switching doors, and like you say, like there's $1 million behind this door, door A, but there's nothing behind doors B and C, and you phrase it enough like the Monty Hall problem, even if you know the $1 million is behind door A, it will say, yes, you should switch from door A. And so like it sometimes overfits to particular corrections of things that it knows to be fallacies. Yeah.
I think we need to be careful here about using knows.
Yes,
Right?
indeed. Yeah,
These systems don't know anything, right? All they are doing is completing auto-generated completion of patterns they have seen in human text or human content. And it's really, really, really easy to ascribe meaning to the models because they look like they know. And that, I think, is one of the fundamental differences here of why this is such an issue. Humankind in the past has always had a really easy trick has been to believe if somebody is fluent, if someone looks like they know, or if some object is fluent and is capable of speaking on a topic, then they know the topic. And large language models break that correlation, right? That's no longer true. And because it's no longer true, actually a whole slew of the evaluations that we used to do on language processing systems now breaks, because we used the shortcut of, as a proxy, was this system more fluent? Then it must be better. And that's not true anymore, because the large language models are infinitely fluent, right? They are really, really fluent. And as you said, they're really great at being prompted to do this in the style of William Shakespeare or of somebody else. And they're really good at that. And they don't know a thing, right? So.
I think the other sort of another part to that question, right, is like not just the models having false data, but then also what data do the models not have? And one of the things that we think about with critical data literacy is like who's not being included in the models that are training these systems. One of my collaborators, and I don't know if I could tell the story the way that she would or with the accuracy that she would, but she was telling me about some work that they're doing in Baltimore where they're trying to understand traffic patterns on the metro there. And so they were making decisions based on sort of looking at the, point-to-point stops that people were getting on and getting off of. But what she was saying was that people in resource-constrained communities often have to take multiple transfers. So they're transferring from place to place to place. And because they're doing all these transfers, but the city is only looking at point-to-point stops, they actually aren't even really being included in this data. So they're getting ready to take certain trips out and away and things like that without even including this group of people. So it's not just like, the false information, but it's also who's not being included in the information that's being collected.
You're in the queue. So I'll hit someone else first, and then you're third in line.
Okay.
There's so many good questions. I'm going to be quick. This is for Tammy, and it's going to be about the potential for productive disagreement and dialogue between a human agent and an AI agent. So I've been given familiarity to a math tool called IXL for about 2 weeks now, and my son used to use or has been using something called Khan Academy that I've been familiar with for a few years. Now, one of the things about IXL I know specifically is if a student is being assessed, tested, the IXL system will actually provide not only a score of how well they're doing, but also a suggestion of do they need help and what subject should they go on to next. If I'm a human agent, especially let's say tutoring underprivileged children, let's say, if I'm a human agent and I just ignore the advice, or selectively take some advice, ignore other advice, what are your thoughts about the use of AI for this specific example with IXL that I'm saying? And also, what do you think the effects and the possibility of productive disagreement, productive adversarial, if you will, keying off, something that a keyword that was said before, adversarial dialogue between human and AI?
Wow, that's a great question. One of the things that we talk about a lot is that the inequities and the sort of the structural oppression and things like that's baked into the way the current policies and the ways that humans do things now are going to get baked into the system, to these systems, right? To these AI systems as well. And I think maybe one of the points that Ellen was making, right, about the scale, right, the scale of the speed of these decisions, right, could really negatively impact a large group of people, and especially if we're looking at if we hold a certain sort of if we look at this data as or the results from these systems as canonical, right, they're absolutely right. They may be a little bit even harder for populations to disagree with. So I think we really have to be mindful of that, and these are one of the things we really have to work on, and I think that's why it's important for us to really be thinking about critical data literacy in what we're doing across the board.
Okay, second to last question.
So for the life of me, I can't really understand how prompting a model could be passed off as creativity, because the way I interpret it, and I don't see how anybody could really dispute this, creativity is a means of expressing your internal state. It's a means of conveying the human condition. And I wasn't so pressed until you talked about this with, school children. I don't really understand how you could pass off prompting ChatGPT and whatnot as creativity.
Oh, thank you for your question. That is a great question. So it depends on how you look at creativity. I think that when you think about it from an AI and education perspective, I would argue that it is creative, because one of the things that you do when you think about creativity is you're bringing together, or you're sort of infusing two sort of things that are typically thought of as disparate. So you don't tend to think of Shakespeare and literature with proofs, right? With mathematical proofs. And so the fact that the prompter was actually like thinking about like, how do I like combine these two things, these two aspects, and they're bringing that to the system, then to me that represents a form of creativity. Now it is I think what you're saying, right, is that the other aspect of it is sort of the length of engagement, and that was what I was talking about with the restorative actions, right, and an activity. So, you know, you really probably want people to engage with it deeply over time. And the fact that you can write that in a few minutes, right, is or a few seconds is also limiting to the creativity factor, or at least the length of engagement that they might pursue with it. But I think that's what some of these efforts that I've been looking at with respect to AI and education have been considering, is like, how do we deeply engage our young people and our learners with these sort of concepts. And so like looking at how AI is so involved in everyday life, like how can we leverage that to really get our kids to think underneath the hood, and really get them involved underneath the hood to think about how they could design new systems and new activities that they want to do with people.
And I suspect that this will be discussed in depth at the panel discussion upstairs, the future of AI in art. So last question.
This is on. I've got like 8 questions and I can't ask 8 questions, so I've got to find a way to distill it down.
Yeah, one short one.
Maybe I could use ChatGPT, but the gentleman's question over there, you in the middle, that was, in my opinion, the best question of the session. This issue of forgetting versus unlearning points to a central issue that's gone undiscussed here, and maybe it's not the right venue for it. Maybe it's too technical. But a number of critics, Gary Marcus, other people who have criticized these models, have pointed out that they have no theory of truth. There's no way to characterize what's false because they have no idea what's true, or any idea that true and false are in opposition. Some of these negative results recently, you've seen the papers come out about equality reasoning. Mark Twain is Sam Clemens, and you'll see that in text all over the place. The sequence will get learned, and then you go ask ChatGPT or GPT-4 or whatever, is Sam Clemens Mark Twain? And you get no. A 4-year-old child can do that, and without exposure to terabytes of data. So I guess the overall question that bundles everything up is there's been little discussion about what the I is in the AI that these things represent. So what is it? A useful engineering tool? It's very good at storing really complicated conditional probabilities over a giant vector space. Great. You know, then why don't we talk about it that way? But we don't. It's become a social phenomenon, and we're imputing to these things features of AGI that I don't think are necessarily warranted. Anyway, it's kind of a statement rather than a question.
Well, no, but I'll let me see if I can turn this into a more pointed question. So, yeah. Ellen, you're now dictator of AI. How would you go about measuring the I in AI?
Yeah, okay, so a glib answer to that is I retired from NIST, right? Partly because I have no idea how you're going to measure these things.
Or you're not in the philosophy department.
I'm not in the philosophy department, no. Humans measuring human intelligence has a very rocky road, right? So I think the real answer to your question is that there is no I there, and the artificial intelligence from the very beginning, frankly, was named artificial intelligence largely as a marketing, approach. They wanted to attract money. And if you call it artificial intelligence, then you have all sorts of different ways that you can tell your story, et cetera, right? These large language models, which is specifically what we're talking about here at this panel, I'll repeat what I said earlier. They don't know, right? They aren't intelligent. They don't know. They don't have a theory of truth or falsehood. They are just, what did you call them? Probabilities over a large vector space.
Conditional probabilities.
Right. Yes. So it helps a lot to keep that in mind, right? When you're trying to decide whether or not there's some there, right? They have their uses. I sound like I'm doom and gloom, and largely I am, but I'm admitting that they have uses. But there are lots of dangers there as well.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So that's it for the questions, but I would like to give the panelists a chance to make a short statement just to sum up and to summarize. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you think should have been covered? No, sorry. No more questions, just final statements. We need to move on to the next.
Yeah, no, I've said enough.
Okay, all right.
No, I don't think I have anything to add except for happy birthday to computer science.
Okay, well, yes, thank you so much to our great panel. Thank you for your great questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer all of them. However, if you go to room 1116 on the first floor, one floor up, there is another panel discussion on the future of AI in art. And so moving away from words and moving to pixels.